There is a moment standing in front of the reconstructed skeleton of Turkana Boy when everything seems to settle into place, when the long limbs, the narrow ribcage and the upright posture come together to form an image that feels almost inevitable, as though this is what an early human should look like, a body already committed to distance walking, already adapted to heat, already stepping into a modern world. It is a powerful image, and for decades it has carried a quiet authority, shaping how millions imagine the emergence of our own body plan. And yet, if one lingers just a little longer, if one looks not at the finished reconstruction but at the underlying fragments and the decisions that brought them together, something begins to shift, not dramatically, but in small, persistent ways, as if the skeleton itself is offering a slightly different story, one that does not quite align with the familiar narrative. The specimen known as Turkana Boy, KNMWT 15000, is described as one of the most complete early human skeletons ever discovered. A juvenile individual dating to around 1.6 million years ago, found near the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. Its completeness has made it a cornerstone of interpretations about early Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, particularly regarding body proportions, growth patterns and locomotion. Because so much of the skeleton is preserved, it has been treated as a kind of anchor, a reference point against which more fragmentary fossils can be compared, and yet completeness does not eliminate interpretation. It simply shifts the focus from missing pieces to how those pieces are assembled and understood. One of the most striking features of the reconstruction is the apparent narrowness of the chest, a ribcage that appears tall and relatively slender, giving the impression of a body already moving toward the elongated, heat-dissipating form associated with modern humans living in tropical environments. This tropical body plan, characterized by long limbs and a narrow torso, has often been presented as evidence that key aspects of human physiology were already in place by the time of early Homo erectus, suggesting a relatively early transition to endurance-based mobility in open savanna environments. However, when one examines the ribs themselves, rather than the assembled reconstruction, a different possibility emerges because the preserved rib fragments suggest a chest that may have been more flared than the model indicates, with a broader lower thorax more reminiscent of earlier hominins. Indeed, recent analysis by Dr. Karen Barb has called into question the entire idea that the tall, gracile human frame evolved in early Homo erectus in Africa, and many anatomists are now quietly saying that Turkana Boy was much more primitive than the museum reconstructions depict. This flaring is not merely a minor variation in shape, but has implications for the entire configuration of the torso, affecting how the lungs expand, how the diaphragm sits, and how the body distributes mass during movement. A more flared chest suggests a different respiratory and biomechanical profile, one that may not align as neatly with the endurance running model often associated with Homo erectus. If the ribcage was indeed wider at the base, then the silhouette of Turkana Boy begins to shift, subtly at first, away from the narrow, almost modern outline and towards something more robust, more transitional, a body that retains aspects of earlier hominin anatomy even as it moves in a more derived direction. The pelvis introduces a similar tension, because its reconstruction has long been debated, particularly regarding its width and overall proportions. A narrower pelvis fits comfortably within the narrative of a streamlined, efficient walker, reducing lateral movement and supporting long-distance travel. But some interpretations of the pelvic fragments suggest that it may have been wider than traditionally depicted, with broader iliac blades and a more expansive pelvic inlet. This is not a trivial adjustment, because pelvic width influences not only locomotion, but also internal organ arrangement and potentially aspects of thermoregulation. A wider pelvis, combined with a more flared rib cage, begins to outline a body that is less gracile than often assumed, one that occupies a space between the stockier builds of earlier hominins and the more elongated forms of later humans. What complicates this picture further is the fact that Turkana Boy was not an adult, but a juvenile, likely between 8 and 11 years old at the time of death, depending on the method used to estimate age. This introduces a layer of developmental uncertainty, because growth patterns in early Homo are not identical to those of modern humans, and the rate at which different parts of the body mature can vary significantly. Dental evidence has often been used to argue that Turkana boy followed a more rapid ape-like growth trajectory, reaching developmental milestones earlier than modern human children, which would imply a shorter overall period of childhood and adolescence.
Did the boy grow up like a modern human, or did he grow up more like an ape?
If this is the case, then projecting the adult form from a juvenile skeleton becomes more complex, because the proportions we see may not simply scale up in a linear fashion. In particular, the face, which is only partially preserved, becomes a site of interpretation, because the degree of prognathism, the forward projection of the face, is known to change during growth. Some models suggest that as Turkana boy matured, his face would have projected more strongly, moving away from the relatively flatter appearance suggested in some reconstructions and toward a morphology more consistent with earlier Homo specimens, including those from Dmanisi in Georgia, which display massive ape-like facial projection despite being broadly classified within the same evolutionary framework. This raises an intriguing possibility that the adult Turkana boy may not have looked as modern as often depicted, but may have retained a more primitive facial structure, one that aligns with a broader pattern of variation within early Homo. This parallels what we can see in chimpanzees, with the infants looking much more human-like than the adults. If so, then the apparent contrast between Turkana boy and more archaic forms may be, at least in part, an artifact of developmental stage and reconstruction choices rather than a clear-cut evolutionary boundary. The comparison with Dmanisi hominins is particularly revealing, because those fossils, dated to around 1.8 million years ago, display a combination of small brain size, around 600 to 750 cubic centimeters, and relatively primitive facial features, yet are often included within the Homo erectus or Homo georgicus grouping. The variability within the Dmanisi sample itself, with significant differences in skull shape and facial projection among individuals, suggests that early Homo populations may have been more morphologically diverse than traditionally assumed. When Turkana boy is placed within this broader context, the differences begin to blur, and the notion of a single, clearly defined body plan emerging at a specific moment becomes less certain. This uncertainty extends to the broader debate about the so-called tropical body plan, the idea that early Homo evolved a narrow, elongated physique as an adaptation to hot, open environments in Africa. While this model has intuitive appeal and is supported by certain anatomical features, it also depends on the assumption that specimens like Turkana boy accurately represent the adult morphology of their populations. If, however, the reconstruction underestimates the width of the chest and pelvis, or if the juvenile proportions do not scale directly to adult form, then the evidence for an early, fully developed tropical body plan becomes less definitive. It's also worth considering whether such a body plan necessarily originated in Africa, or whether it could have emerged in multiple regions as populations adapted to similar environmental pressures. The presence of early Homo outside Africa, including at sites like Dmanisi, suggests that dispersal occurred relatively early, and that populations may have been adapting to a range of environments simultaneously. In this context, the features attributed to the tropical body plan may not be exclusive to a single lineage or location, but part of a broader pattern of convergent or parallel evolution. All of these considerations bring us back to the central question, not of whether Turkana boy represents an early human, but of how precisely we can define what that means. The skeleton remains one of the most important discoveries in paleoanthropology, providing invaluable insights into early Homo anatomy, yet it is also a reminder that even the most complete fossils require interpretation, and that those interpretations are shaped by both the available evidence and the frameworks within which that evidence is understood. When the flaring of the ribs is reconsidered, when the pelvis is allowed to widen, when growth patterns are examined through a lens that does not assume modern human development, and when facial projection is allowed to follow a trajectory consistent with other early Homo specimens, the image of Turkana boy begins to change, not into something entirely different, but into something less fixed, less certain, more open to variation. The clean, streamlined figure becomes more complex, carrying traces of both derived and primitive traits, a mosaic rather than a linear progression. And in that shifting image, there is a subtle but important implication, because if one of the most complete and iconic fossils can be reinterpreted in this way, then the broader narrative of early human evolution, built in part upon that fossil, may also be more flexible than it appears. The question is not whether the traditional reconstruction is entirely wrong, but whether it represents one possible interpretation among several, each with its own assumptions and implications. In the end, Turkana Boy does not lose its significance under this scrutiny, but gains a different kind of importance, becoming not just a window into the past, but a lens through which we can examine the process of reconstruction itself, the ways in which bones are translated into bodies and bodies into stories. It is in that process, in the quiet decisions about angles, proportions and growth, that the past is shaped, and where occasionally something does not quite fit, inviting us to look again, to question, and to consider the possibility that the story is still unfolding. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.
Typically, Homo erectus probably wasn't as tall as we initially suspected from the Turkana Boy fossils. Something else that's worth noting is that the initial reconstruction of the rib cage and the pelvis of the Turkana Boy indicated that it had a kind of long and narrow body type, like certain groups of modern humans living in sub-Saharan Africa, like the Maasai or the Turkana people. And this kind of led to all sorts of ideas about how their bodies were adapted for the hot, dry climate they lived in. Whereas you might contrast that with Neanderthals that are kind of wide and barrel-chested, and maybe that's more of a cold-adapted body type. But since that time, there's been another pelvis recovered and assigned to Homo erectus, not without debate. But that pelvis is much wider. It has a much more flaring blades that kind of wrap around the side of the pelvis. And that shape is actually more primitive. And it suggests that perhaps there might have been an error in the reconstruction of the Turkana Boy pelvis. And then just last year in 2020, they did a virtual reconstruction of the rib cage, the thoracic cage that surrounds your lungs and your heart. And based on the kind of shape and angulation of the ribs and the vertebra, the backbones behind that, they suggested that in fact the rib cage is quite deep from front to back and wider than initially reconstructed. And if you put those two pieces of evidence together, it suggests that while the limb bones seem more modern, the limb proportions, the kind of the core, if you will, of the body was not fully modern in Homo erectus, and that modern human rib cage and pelvis appeared later in evolution.